Thanks, Beth. Through our ongoing fight against Kinder Morgan and the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I've become acquainted with Quetzalcoatl, an activist and scholar who is a friend of Bill Reid's. She argues that land acknowledgements that recognize the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people deny the overlapping traditional rights of the 54 tribes on the Coast Salish territories who shared the rich resources in the Vancouver area, including her tribe, the Stolo, who live between Hope and Langley. She suggests we should be acknowledging the Coast Salish people inclusively. So I'd like to acknowledge her on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. I'd like to thank Beth for hosting this seminar, and Brian Miles of SFU, and Alaya Bouvbard, who helped me sort out my slides here, because I am not a digital wizard. I was having a major meltdown. Nancy calmed me down one night, my wife, and told me, why don't you just dust off your old Kodiak projector and we'll have a traditional slideshow, just, same era as the whale. And I thought, hey, that was brilliant. So I got a good night's sleep. Anyway, the next morning, my daughter bailed me out, Nicola. I didn't know she was a digital wizard, but she is. And is she here? No, not yet? There you are. So anyway, got that sorted out. And the irony isn't lost on me that she's an orca biologist. She spent 2 years up in Robson Bight, another year coming up. So it's funny, what goes around comes around here. I wanted to talk about the nature of clay and plaster for Bill Reid. He used it throughout the 1980s, and it cuts like fresh alder. It has about the consistency of alder. But unlike wood, you can add on. And I brought a piece of plaster here. I just wanted to show you how beautifully this stuff cuts. To think that you can actually add on. I mean, it was brilliant. It was the material for Bill throughout the 80s, because it didn't matter what kind of changes you were making. It didn't matter how many times you were changing your mind. You could literally rough up the surface, add a little bit of white glue to your plaster to make it stronger. But look at that. As long as the plaster's wet, it cuts like butter. Okay? It just cuts like butter. And when the plaster's dry, you can lacquer it, you can seal it. It's great for making molds from. It really is a magic material, vastly underrated, I think. This is a mask that Bill Kuchin carved of Bill Reid. It's alder. And so if anyone has any questions, you can just direct them to George, okay? So, but if you ask me anything I can't answer, I'm just going to direct the questions over here, okay? Bill saw the tools he made in his early 60s as his friends. They were holders of his past, and he felt they possessed the events of his life. Regarding dull tools, he said, dull tools are like dull people. They're a dangerous waste of time. Bill was great with his quotes. He's got many, many great ones. My sculpture instructor, Jack Harmon, invited Bill Reid to give a seminar on his career at the Vancouver School of Art when I was in second year in 1972. Bill was drumming up interest in a jewelry course, but nobody signed up. Everybody wanted to make sculpture. I had some burning questions for him about how he negotiates the path he's on, but I bit my tongue. He looked like he was in enough pain as it was. I assumed he didn't need a naive question from a second year student about which cosmology he's loyal to. While I worked for Bill throughout the 1980s, I realized he was negotiating similar questions I had as a student. I came to see how colonialism created a multitude of complications and opportunities throughout his life. I saw how he used his trickster talents to be generous. He used every bit of influence to get things done, unapologetically, and he wasn't scared of controversy. This exhibition dealing with Bill Reid's 100th has opened up my memory vault and my archives. In some ways, the making of his whales feels like yesterday. But looking at how young we are in these photographs, I know it was not yesterday. I borrowed some pictures from this talk. Sorry, I borrowed some photos for this talk, but most of them are mine. I made an effort to document the processes in Bill's studio as I had the support to use the images for educational purposes, like this. And it wasn't easy stopping to wash the plaster off my hands to take a photograph. I knew the events transpiring in Bill's studio were of historic importance. Even the cedar holster he carved for his cordless phone became a really important Bill Reid. I decided not to self-censor this seminar because you had to play Bill's games if you worked for him. So I'll refer to Bill the trickster when I'm talking about his mischievous side that drove his serious playfulness and his self-deprecating humor. I think really bright people always find ways to enliven things by creating complexity and intensity around them. Right, Mike? Following the completion of The Raven and the First Men, the trickster swore he'd never take on another big project. I worked for a 2-year period with him and his crew, George Norris, Gu Zhao, and Jim Hart. Walter Kerner would come by every 2 weeks to give Bill another check to keep things going. And they always joked about which of them would live to see the piece completed. On its completion, I thought I'd never see Bill again. Then, surprisingly, after a few months, he asked me if I'd carve a stone box with a lid for a silver salmon relief. It was a commission for the Law of the Sea conference. I carved it in black diorite, and I began to see a pattern in ongoing work with Bill. This work allowed me to buy tools and finance my own unsellable projects. It was the early 80s, and philanthropist James Graham was financing a major expansion of the Vancouver Aquarium. It was to include a marine-themed sculpture for a public plaza. Bill was originally interested in that commission, but then he withdrew. At that time, Bill had signed an agreement to be represented by a dealer, the late Liz Nichols of the Equinox Gallery. She was controlling the trickster's commissions and studio sales, or at least she tried to. At the time, Bill was under a lot of pressure to complete a model for Mythic Messengers. It was well overdue. The architect Rudy Kovac wanted it completed for his Teleglobe building in Burnaby. Bill wanted me to prepare for a scale-up, so I sub-rented a studio space on Granville Island from the tenant, sculptor Barry Cogswell. The Granville Island Trust originally dedicated that studio at 1659 Duranlow for non-commercial studio activity for rotating artists so the public could see non-commercial art in process. It's the studio of glass artist John Nutter, a longtime assistant to Bill. The legacy of that space demands it become a carving center for Aboriginal artists. A contract was drawn up for me to scale up Mythic Messengers, but I refused to sign it until a model was resolved. I needed something to work from. Bill was distracted with other projects and life. The search for an artist to make a public sculpture for the Aquarium Plaza continued. There was an artist with the alias of Robert Fish that proposed big rubber fish hanging from big drying racks. But what they really wanted was a Bill Reid. Robert Davidson was eventually awarded the commission. He created a split image of converging Haida orcas. Bill didn't have any work for me at the time, so I worked for Robert, scaling up his yellow cedar to a much larger intermediate plaster as reference for a monumental bronze. Robert had it cast as a bronze edition at Jack Harmon Sculpture Foundry, located in a huge warehouse east of Gastown, where my studio was. Look at how young Robert is there. There's Reg on the lower left. He's scooping out a big mask. His brother. The trickster was upset I was working for the competition. But I found Robert to be a man of few words and a lot of discipline. He was very fair and a very appreciative employer. It was 1982. I was at my East End condo one afternoon listening to Beethoven very loud when I got a call from the trickster asking if I could turn off the music and come to his studio at 41st and Arbutus. This is a Robert Keiser photograph. He obviously documented Bill in the process here. There you are. Thank you for that photograph, Robert. As with The Raven and the First Men, Bill was in the process of creating a tiny boxwood concept model. It was a Haida orca with a massive dorsal fin. The fin was so large and regal, I saw it as a powerful metaphor of the wealth of the ocean and the heraldry of the Haida people. But the animal was standing entirely on the tips of its tail flukes. That works fine on a miniature scale, but on a monumental scale, the armature required to support that cantilevered weight would be a major project in itself. Bill was confident engineers could deal with that, or anything else for that matter. The fact that Robert was well on his way to creating the first monumental Haida bronze was driving the trickster crazy. He decided he wanted the aquarium job after all. He told me to put mythic messengers on ice. Rudy Kovac was outraged. He threw a tantrum and tore up the contract in front of us. Jack Harmon was given the task of roughing up the clay sections of that piece so we could get onto it after the whale was done. Bill's first task was to establish the scale of his piece. We made an 18-foot tall plywood silhouette profile based on Bill's Boxwood model. I painted a 16-foot profile on it. And then the architect wanted me to paint a 14-foot profile on it too, which I refused to do. We made a very rough 18-foot fiberglass mock-up over a 5-day period. And we cited all these props on location for a big meeting with everyone involved. There's Jim Hart, and there's the whale, the fiberglass rough-up on the back of my little truck. We had to take the dorsal off to get under that old stone bridge as you go into Stanley Park. The architect insisted on a 14-foot piece. He didn't want the sculpture to interfere with his architecture. Bill preferred the larger sizes but was willing to compromise on a 16-foot version. My opinion is that orcas are huge. Therefore, the piece needed to feel huge. I made the ultimatum. I wasn't going to get involved in the project at all, unless it was 18 feet tall. And because molten bronze shrinks a 1/4 inch to the foot, when it cools, the plaster pattern needed to be 18 foot, 6 inches tall to arrive at an 18-foot finished version. I know scale is an artistic call, but Bill was humored. Our intentions synchronized, and we won. I drew up a quote for the scale-up of the whale. I was in my early 30s and very enthusiastic. I prepared a bare-bones budget that included my wages for 4 months, wages for my assistant, Jack Carson, a friend I had in high school who became a steel-hulled sailboat builder and designer. He worked with me throughout the project. He sailed around the world in his boat, and he hasn't spoken to me for 20 years, so he'll get over it. My quote included all the plaster, the steel, the burlap, welding rods, abrasives. Taxes not included, as I had no idea what tax rates were. I did add a clause that stated that I needed to work from a well-resolved model and that any major changes would be extra beyond my quote. That's foreshadowing. The first stage was to make a 1/6 scale model of the 18-foot version in clay. It needed to be proportioned to work on a monumental scale. So I roughed up the clay and Bill refined the form. I was his other side man. Here, see the armature inside that plywood profile? So here's the clay has been thrown onto the clay armature and Bill's refining it. I purposely made the armature on 3 points because there's a powerful negative space that I didn't want to destroy. Most people would put a pipe into the belly. They did that in Ottawa when they mounted the big one. It was just awful. I see they've changed it. Notice also on the little boxwood there, the pectoral fin just has one curve in it, whereas on this version it has an S curve, right? And also there's all kinds of details taking place in the embroidery on the surface that weren't there in the little one. Because what Bill was doing here was predicting what would work well on an 18-foot version, not what works well on a 3-foot version. Okay. Bill loved clay. He loved the immediacy of clay. So there's Murray Newman, the head of the Vancouver Aquarium, and Liz Nichols. Here you can see I've made a mold of 1/2 of the whale, the clay whale. Liz Nichols didn't believe I had the skills to execute the project, and she pressured Bill to get rid of me so he could get on with things. Whenever she repeated those demands throughout the whole project, Bill would chuckle later as he couldn't figure out how she thought he was going to get his work done. I made a plaster waste mold of the clay, cast it in plaster. And then Jim Hart came to refine the surfaces, or what Bill referred to as the embroidery. Bill referred to Jim's impeccable definition on many of his pieces as a drum-tight skin that holds his pieces together. Liz arranged for a photographer to photograph Bill and Jim. That photo was published on the back cover of Canadian Art magazine. I then made a rubber mold of one side of his piece. Then I sawed the plaster into whale steaks. So that sounds a bit like commodity, doesn't it? Anyway, I traced the stakes onto a grid, manually expanded the grid, and made a full-size map that defined the entire body and its ovoid recesses. Now, this map has the entire whale on it, okay? Including the pectorals, the flukes, the dorsal, everything. So I traced those profiles onto plywood and cut out the templates. The next stage is where the first major cultural difference between Bill's assumption as to how I would proceed and how I actually planned and budgeted to proceed through my training and experience in European-based sculpture conventions became apparent. I began organizing the templates in a vertical format to weld the armature and build the clay in its upright, completed pose, the way you'd see the whale in its finished location. Bill was surprised I planned to work vertically. He assumed I'd be doing the work horizontally, and he insisted I divide the whale in half. This was far more labor-intensive, but I was willing to go that route if it worked for Bill. Working horizontally at floor level would also provide easier access for him, considering his mobility issues. He was convinced he couldn't work on a scaffold. I realized Bill felt comfortable working horizontally as he had carved totem poles that way, briefly assisting Mungo Martin, and then with Doug Cramner in the 1960s, producing his Totem Village over a 3-year period at UBC. Bill was as knowledgeable about carving totem poles as he was about jewelry techniques. When modeling in the clay, he would move around the body. I saw this as an Aboriginal approach to making, working down on the subject in a universal manner, as with his drawings, where he was constantly rotating the image as he worked. This was a similar method to carving totem poles horizontally within the mannerist conventions of elongated forms, forms that would be foreshortened when the viewer looked up at an erected pole. This approach to monumental sculpting is fundamentally different than European-based conventions, where the original clay form is modeled in its final position. That way, the artist's perspective of the form during the making reads the same way it would when seen completed. Jackson Pollock was one of the first non-Aboriginal artists to work with the notion of universal relationships to the picture plane. Removing his canvas from the easel and the wall, he performed his work on the floor to the rhythms of jazz music. Historians believe he was influenced by Navajo sand painters who created their images and ritual with the controlled falling of colored sands. His images have no scale. They're both micro and macro. Another contemporary artist, Michael Heiser, best describes the conventions of Western sculpture and its integral relation to its base with his piece at Myrtle Edwards Park in Seattle. It's entitled Upon, Against, Adjacent. It speaks to the relationship of the subject to its place of origin. The base is a foundation anchored to the site of the event portrayed. To Heiser, raw stone is creative potential, as it was for Michelangelo, where the raw stone engulfing his slaves is chaos, the unformed. If I was asked to place Bill's Skidegate pole within Heiser's contextual statement, it would be upon, because it's upon Haida Gwaii. The spirit of Haida Gwaii would be against when it was in process here on the West Coast, but it became adjacent when it went to the Canadian Embassy in Washington. Bill's chief of the Undersea World and Mythic Messengers would be against when they're here on the West Coast, although not in Haida Gwaii territory. It was Bill that was adjacent. Light reads differently when complex forms change their orientation. The subtleties of the form could never have been rendered horizontally on the Spirit of Haida Gwaii or the Raven and the First Men, works that function more within the traditions of European-based modeling. The UBC curator Scott Watson described the Spirit of Haida Gwaii as Rodin-esque, but I think it's much more akin to Bernini's use of undulating form. While discussing Bernini and his own work, the trickster said, "Great art comes out of great patronage." I thought this statement could be true. It was true for Bernini. It was true for the trickster at that time. But many artists have made great art without any patronage. Bill made masterpieces at his jewelry bench long before he had any real patronage. Getting back to the trickster's whale, we then made two precisely built whale profile tables. They needed to bend in opposite directions for the curve of the dorsal fin. Then we assembled the templates, and I welded the steel frame inside them, and we covered it with steel mesh. The clay was about 2 inches thick to hold moisture and allow for deep modeling. Once we removed the templates, we could refine the clay planes. So here we are modeling the clay inside the patterns, and once they're removed, it was amazing what happened. You could rework those forms and get them just as true as can be. Bill loved the tactile quality of clay, the process of working additively or reductively to resolve the form. Here he is using a wire tool. It was very immediate. It was the perfect medium to rough in the form. The clay was about the consistency of a warm cheese, so you could just slice through it, add on. He always set his glasses down when he was working up close. Then he could never find them when he was leaving. So here I am, I've got the aluminum shims on the collar there. I'm ready to start splashing the plaster on. See that white model behind me there? Bill painted green on all the high spots, which are the outer skin. Everything else is recessed. That was his way of informing people what's outer layer and what's the onion layers beneath the skin. So here I've made a big plaster mold with 2x4 framework on it. I had my chain block attached to a big beam in the ceiling. So we'd lift the mold off the clay and then cast it. And then there's the first casting of the first whale back on its table again. Once half of the whale was modeled, we made a mold of it and cast it in plaster on a pre-welded steel frame. Then positioned the plaster cast on its table. Then we started the second half of the whale's body. At this point, we had half the whale in clay and half in plaster. Nowadays, projects like this are scanned and printed in plastic, a process that denies the hands-on and all the intuitive responses to scale changes that enliven the form during the making. The justification for 3D printing is often the expediency, but people have forgotten how efficient and rewarding clay modeling can be. Molds can be so beautiful. I photographed the inside of the spirit canoe mold. It was like being inside an ice cave with light coming in through the holes for the legs and the arms and the wings. Here I am soaping up the mold for hours so the soap saturates into the plaster. Then you give it a really thin wipe of Vaseline. Here you can see the head has been cast, where I have the frame ready to cast the body. There's the 30-year-old me splashing plaster in. By the way, it was really funny. Bill was curious, where did I get that t-shirt? It had his whale on it. I said, well, I just bought it off the Greenpeace boat. It's tied up right over there. They're getting ready to go to Russia. And he was furious. He said, they never asked me for that. So he went storming up the gangplank. I follow him up there. And on the way up the gangplank, he notices that the Sassoodle design on their smokestack is all wrong. He didn't get it right at all. So he orders them to get him a piece of paper. So the whole crew is crowding around Bill while he draws them a new smokestack design, right? But that was Bill for you, So when you've Vaseline the mold properly, it just pulls off the positive really, really beautifully. There's Bill with the big head. You can see Jim Hart behind him there working on the plaster. Once all the whale plasters were done, they were spread around the floor on dollies. The trickster began filling them and beveling the seams, treating each section as an independent unit. He was under the assumption we would clean up these plasters and ship them off to the foundry. I insisted he not rework the plaster sections as they wouldn't fit together properly. Once the whole plaster was assembled standing, the entire surface could be reworked as a whole. Bill was surprised I intended to assemble it, but it was my intention all along. As I was working, the trickster surprised me with an angry outburst. He chastised me for not following orders and not understanding the tasks. But he wasn't making any sense. His comments had nothing to do with the job. Then I saw a film crew behind him. They were documenting a day in his life. Had I been told about the performance, I could have really played it up. But I probably looked stunned enough as it was. It was times like this when I was working for the other Bill, the legendary artist who gave far more than he took. That event reminded me of another one of Bill's quotes, "No good deed goes unpunished." Conversely, there were times when he was overly complimentary and appreciative. It just depended on what day it was. This was a period when I suspected Bill's Parkinson's drugs were affecting his moods and perception. He seemed to be suffering from a myopic-like condition where he would focus on one area and chop, file, or grind off the form around it. This condition robbed him of his ability to see the parts in relation to their context. Whether sharpening tools or carving, he was deep carving to the extreme. He was literally carving through to the other side. But his art drove him. He was always working on multiple projects in different disciplines in his studio and at home. I often thought of artists such as Giacometti or Van Gogh, who had perceptual disorders that contributed to their unique expressions. I took on the work of designing the process to accommodate his challenges. This became acutely demanding as he slowly progressed through the making of the Spirit of Haida Gwaii, but I'll save that for another seminar. The studio was often bustling with friends, artists, writers, Haida elders, and tourists. It was often a challenge getting his attention and keeping the shop safe. By the way, this is the famous actress Shirley MacLaine with Arthur Erickson. Shirley made a huge fuss over Bill. It was so sweet. And I remember Joni Mitchell came in. You know, she waited for 2 hours while Bill was on the phone. She wanted to make she wanted to commission a bracelet, but I don't think it happened. I remember one time these important Supreme Court judges came in one winter, and one of them was in a floor-length, dark blue felt coat. It's probably worth a fortune, you know. And I had just made a batch of plaster, and I told him to stand back, and he just turned his back to me. You know, and I thought, okay, that's pretty typical of a Supreme Court judge. And I wasn't going to waste a batch of plaster, so I just flung it onto the plaster, and it ricocheted right up the back of his coat. He walked out of there looking like a skunk. Occasionally, when Bill had taken his pills on time, he would get out of his chair and move like he was perfectly healthy. Like the time he borrowed a bike and rode around Granville Island, weaving through the crowd. I could hardly believe my eyes. I grabbed my camera and asked him to circle around for me so I could get a photograph before he took off. Once we had the pattern of the whale assembled vertically, Bill was surprised at how different the form read under the skylight. Seen in a new light, he was not happy with the orientation of the main ovoid on the whale's body. It needed to take a dramatic shift forwards to achieve the thrust he wanted. This was one of the major changes I was ready for. I know things need to evolve, but there also needs to be a separate budget to cover extra labor costs. Of course, Liz Nichols refused to recognize this as a major change, so I absorbed the extra time repositioning the ovoid and its extending U-forms. We built scaffolding with railings around the piece, and Bill felt safe and content while we were resculpting the ovoid. In the end, I believe Bill achieved the most elegant ovoid in the entire realm of Northwest Coast art. I've never seen any other ovoid that possesses its dignity and presence. By the way, I photographed this on a 3-legged ladder yesterday at the aquarium. I'm up about 18 feet there. And as I was photographing it, a fly landed on the ovoid. And I'm thinking that is empirical proof that this is big jewelry and not sculpture. If something that tiny is a fly in the ointment, on that scale, that's proof. The exposed muscle forms on each side of the ovoid were inspired by a Haida artifact, a painted leather pigment bag that caught Bill's attention years earlier. Throughout my years with the trickster, I was often surprised at how he would take a lumber crayon and draw out complex surface designs on a blank plane with apparent ease. It was like he was pulling rabbits out of a hat. He was a living encyclopedia of Haida iconography. Once the plaster was resolved, we coated it with layers of white lacquer to harden the surface. At that point, the owner of the foundry from New York, Dick Pollock, flew out to quote the bronze casting task. That's my favorite shot of Bill, Robert. I love that photograph. It really speaks to Bill's determination. Jack Harmon could have cast Bill's whale here in Vancouver, but Liz Nichols insisted he provide a bond, meaning he provides her with a check that covers the cost of the job. If the piece is behind schedule or any problems occur, she would have the right to cash it. Jack was scared of those conditions. The Talix foundry had a big budget and Dick wanted to undertake the job. I warned Dick to establish a large budget to cover the demands of chasing the bronze to Bill's impeccable jewelry standards, where the light reflections off the bronze body needed to read with absolute precision. To Bill, this was an 18-foot tall piece of Haida jewelry. This meant the bronze required extra wall thickness and deep weld penetrations to allow for extra grinding. So for Bill, I think it was absolutely integral that all the convex forms read as one absolute perfect unit. You couldn't have variations on the surface. It just didn't work for him. We worked to extremely tight tolerances to maintain the symmetry on the plaster pattern. More foreshadowing. We created the plaster sections for the trip to the foundry. Bill kept the blowhole mask and kept refining it. He seemed obsessed with that hawk mask and reworked it compulsively. Then he mailed it to the foundry later. When the crates arrived in New York, I couldn't open them. I didn't know the Americans don't use square Robertson screws. They only use Phillips. We mailed them screwdriver heads. Then they ended up using the back end of tapping threads to open the crates. I had written whale jokes all over the insides of the crates. Like, how do you circumcise a whale? With 4 skin divers. Anyway, this is Nancy Graves. And she had just cast all these bronze organic found objects, and they were spread all over Bill's crates. She was welding them into these beautiful tree forms that you could walk under. The Talix foundry was a massive and extremely high-tech foundry. It was a living museum with technicians assisting important artists who were working beside us and joining us for lunch at the local spaghetti house. I spent some time observing all the ceramic shell casting techniques so I could eventually teach processes with a high-tech edge. When we arrived at the foundry, I was surprised the entire whale was sand cast rather than lost wax cast. Resin-cured sand molds have no flexibility. Even the whale's teeth that appeared to have lots of undercuts were sand cast. The only part that was ceramic shell lost wax cast was the blowhole hawk mask. Bill's 3-foot intermediate sized whale was already cast in bronze, and Bill got to work refining it to set a standard for the degree of finish he wanted on the big piece. The technicians had welded the major body sections together on the Monumental piece, and they were in the process of welding a grid of 3/4-inch stainless plates tailored to fit through the tail flukes and up the spine to support the piece. This stainless armature was a major engineering feat, requiring multiple stainless plates honeycombed together and completely welded throughout. Once it was complete, the last bronze cast sections were welded in place and the refinishing began, grinding the welds and sanding the surfaces. The foundry chasers completed their task to their usual standards. Then they thought they were ready to apply the patina and the final coat of wax. That's when Bill stepped in and told them they were just getting started. In Dick's opinion, Bill was being unreasonable. He felt the grinding, filing, and sanding was all done. and the public would never notice minor undulations. But to Bill, the overall reflections weren't consistent. To him, the surface needed to be free of undulations. They needed to be true. The confrontation was at a stalemate. The foundry required more funding to cover more labor. Bill was defending his position in meetings. Liz Nichols told Bill that I shouldn't be encouraging him to hold such impeccable standards. But the standards were Bill's. It was Haida art, and he wasn't going to compromise. We were stuck in a hotel room for days while Bill was talking to lawyers. Then James Graham released more funds, and that changed everything. We went back to the foundry, and Bill insisted that Dick round up all his metal chasers for a seminar on the structure of Haida ovoids. He gave his famous seminar on the ovoid and its origins, the ball and socket joint. He described how to define the onion layers of the embroidery and how to make emery sticks to hand sand convex planes. It was amusing to see the trickster training New York technicians on the subtleties of Haida art and detailed iconography. Bill was impressed at how quickly they caught on. Bill the Icebreaker was once again clearing the way for other Haida artists to follow in his wake. The only compromise the trickster had to make was to listen to the foundry chasers' rap music after hours. Bill was used to calling the music shots in his workspace. It was classical all the way. But the foundry techs had an agreement that if they worked extra hours, they could listen to whatever music they wanted, as loud as they wanted. And the trickster had no say in the matter. So ear protectors became his uniform. This debacle over finish was predictable. The foundry was familiar with abstract expressionist work. They were casting the work of de Kooning and Frank Stella, Nancy Graves. By the way, this is Tony Putnam, Dick Polich's wife. They split up after that, and she started her own big foundry. But she was an expert at patinating. There's Frank Stella. He was throwing ladles of molten aluminum into his compositions to achieve spontaneous texture. That didn't interest Bill in the slightest. Nancy Graves was casting leaves, fish, and found objects and welding them into tree forms the viewer could walk under. Everything was heavily textured. Weld seams and grinder marks were part of the truth to process aesthetic. Months later, I couldn't sleep one Sunday morning. I decided to drive to Stanley Park to watch the sunrise from Brockton Point. I passed a flatbed truck and recognized a large whale wrapped in packing blankets, so I flagged the driver down. I ran up and said, "You've got Bill's whale." It was supposed to be arriving by surprise from New York, but the driver was lost and he was trying to find the Bayshore Inn. I piloted him there, and the next day cranes were in place at the aquarium to position Bill's whale in its new circular pool. This was another moment that exposed differences in culturally specific sculpture-making traits. Because the water in the pool provided a perfect plane, it exposed the asymmetry in the way the piece had been welded together. Unlike our pattern that had been refined to impeccable symmetry, one tail fluke was higher than the other in the bronze. So the only way to correct that was to raise one side of the body, which threw the whole center line off. So the tail flukes remained slightly askew. It's not noticeable to the general public. After all, whales' bodies are organic, but the trickster wasn't happy. The importance of bilateral symmetry to Bill's art wasn't fully understood in New York. The powerful negative space I was referring to earlier was intensified when the piece was installed. Supported entirely on its tail flukes, the piece defies gravity, frozen in an animated leap. Bill's favorite quote, "Joy is the well-made object," or "The most interesting things happen at the crossroads of cultures." I believe Bill's later drawings of transient whale pods hunting for prey allude to his sculptural ideas that he would have pursued had he been able to remain active in his golden years. Now that captive killer whales aren't part of the show at the Vancouver Aquarium, and out of respect for the sacred Sawaikwe Salish site where the aquarium sits, I would like to see Bill's Chief of the Undersea World relocated to the Museum of Anthropology, where it can be seen in relation to other masterpieces. I believe it's seen in a token way by tourists at Stanley Park. Having that piece, the first monumental Haida bronze, living with other Aboriginal masterpieces, both old and new, within the scholarly context of the museum would do the piece justice. Following Bill's whale project, I worked for months helping him on the clay and plasters of mythic messengers, but that's a whole other story with fascinating revelations along the way. Following the completion of Mythic Messengers, I told Bill how amazing it would be to make a piece so big he could walk inside the mold. Bill's usual mantra was, there aren't going to be any more big projects. That was prior to his spirit canoe. At that time, Jack Harmon's foundry was bustling with Aboriginal artists. There you can see the 5 sections of the Mythic Messengers being cast in bronze there. As printmaking was to the 70s, the Bronze Age had arrived in the 80s. It was a new tradition, as a trickster would say, and an appropriate one considering copper was once more valuable than gold to Aboriginal artists. Rick Adkins was the first Haida artist I know of to have his work cast in bronze. His work was an inspiration to Bill. Rick created a large bear mask and a freestanding sculpture of a speared bear. I recently saw an unfinished casting of it in Gibson's. He gave it to a mutual friend, a sculptor, Steve Major, about 40 years ago. Rick carved argillite in the corner of my studio, and I could see he was an intensely three-dimensional thinker. The New Channel artist Joe David was also having bronze pieces cast. He had a studio in the building as well. He had an edition of these anatomically subtle bronze masks cast. At that time, the late Saskatchewan artist Joe Fafard, who was famous for his small ceramic sculpture, was making an edition of 8 life-size bronze cows. They were to be sited on a lawn in front of a bank tower in Toronto. Joe David expressed his disdain for those cows, an invasive species in bison habitat. He saw them as big, stupid symbols of agrarian settler culture. He couldn't understand why anyone would want to make a monument to those obese animals that had lost all their instincts when you could be portraying wild animals. Robert Davidson's reflected whales were being cast, along with an edition of large stylized frogs. Jim Hart was having a model totem pole cast. Inuit artist David Rubin and Abraham Atunguk were having large pieces cast. All this work required an unprecedented degree of metal finishing, never required before by non-Aboriginal sculptors. I was casting a frieze of large skulls and a highly realistic 7-foot tall blue heron skull with highly polished surfaces. Jim Hart has continued having Italics Foundry cast his work, and the Bronze Era continues on with Guy Edenshaw casting his totem at the Burton Foundry on Salt Spring Island, where his father, Gujau, has recently cast a series of large raven rattles. Beautiful Haida raven rattle. Regarding the curvilinear style of Bill's Chief of the Undersea World, I think it's fascinating to see how Bill threw the French curve into everything since he carved a small boxwood raven in the First Men in Montreal in 1973. When viewed from multiple angles, that piece is composed of oscillating ovoids. The bottom oval is the foundation representing the beach. I think it's unfortunate it's covered in sand at the MOA. Then there's the circular clamshell, and the raven's wings, and the thrust of its body. All these components appear to oscillate off a central core. This piece marks the launch of Bill's unique sculptural style. Bill's pole, raised in Skidegate in 1975, was rendered in his curvilinear style. He worked within the highly ordered conventions of Haida totems, yet he made this work unique with a curvilinear rhythm that flows like a Bach symphony through the entire length of the pole. I've recently become interested in Bill's erotic drawings. I've seen one collection, and I have arrangements to see another. I'm interested in what's public and what's private, and what taboos prevent drawings from being exhibited. Some of his erotic themes are integrated into his public pieces. They're Haida creation stories, rendered in stylized form, therefore acceptable. To many people, the same stories rendered realistically become naughty fantasies of interspecies cavorting. Why then is Picasso's erotic bestiary of minotaurs, satyrs, and nymphs celebrated, yet the trickster's drawings are rarely seen? Is there a neoconservative censoring underway? When I was teaching in the art department at Capilano University, administration would circulate a form to the faculty at the end of each spring semester. They wanted us to provide them with information on upgrades for our education, for credentials they could add to our names. For decades, I informed them I'd worked extensively with Bill Reid as a studio sculptor and had been immersed in his unique epistemology, helping to give form to his culturally hybrid sculptural works that contributed to the evolution of Aboriginal material culture. Every year they responded by saying that doesn't qualify. It's not part of a recognized institution. I'd respond stating Bill was more qualified than most teachers of master's level courses. He had 9 honorary doctorates from Canadian universities and was a renowned artist. My decade-long dialogue with Bill put me in touch with the dynamic people who dedicated their lives to the resurgence of their cultures. It exposed me to a worldview that informs my practice and determination as an ally to ongoing campaigns for Aboriginal and environmental justice. Every year, the bureaucrats said they wouldn't recognize that as legitimate. I saw their denial as a systemic bias that ignores the very essence of the university, an institution that began in the philosophers' guilds. It was originally born as a core of democracy and to seek enlightenment, or as Ian Angus says, to love the questions, rather than enforcing protocols at the cost of creativity. Capilano administration then eliminated studio art. Our program was based on critical thinking and critical making, providing an awareness that enables students to question, to find their own voice, and possibly influence social change. Now art within the corporate university model is designed to serve industry. The work that took place between the trickster and me and my associates would never have been possible hadn't it been for the fortune of us being trained in the skills and philosophy that art school provided. We don't know the extent of what's being lost by slashing the visual arts and the humanities. No one can see into the future to see collaborations that won't be taking place because people aren't being brought together and enlightened through education. Gabriel Roy's quote on Bill's $20 bill says it all. Could we ever know each other in the slightest without the arts?